You're listening to Addressing Gettysburg.
June 15th, 1863. Today we heard that the rebels were crossing the river in heavy force and advancing on this state. Sarah Broadhead.
In the 1730s and 40s, Scotch-Irish and German settlers began laying roots in what was then known as the Marsh Creek Settlement. Eventually, Samuel Geddes opened a tavern on the Marsh Creek Road, the major east-west road in the area. In 1761, he was fined for running a tavern without a license. In 1769, the Baltimore-Shippensburg Road was laid out and an intersection was created at the tavern. 25 years later, in 1786, his son James would lay out 210 lots, including a town square referred to as the Diamond, around the tavern. This new town would be known as Gettysburg. In 1800, Gettysburg became the county seat of the newly formed Adams County, named for then-President John Adams. The 1860 census shows that Gettysburg's population numbered around 2,400 and was primarily made up of German, Scots-Irish, and free blacks. The overwhelmingly Christian population of the town worshipped in 8 congregations and 7 churches. As the center of Adams County's legal business, Gettysburg was home to several lawyers. Education was well covered in Gettysburg. Private schools, including carriages on the Chambersburg Pike and Rebecca Eyster's on the corner of High Street in Washington, Pennsylvania College, established in 1832, and the Lutheran Theological Seminary educated the youth from near and far. To support the large amounts of farms in the surrounding townships, various merchants kept shop there. Some people, such as Mary McAllister, made money by reselling cured meats that she had obtained from the farmers of the area to her fellow Gettysburgians. Others owned butcher shops, like James Pierce, who lived on the southwest corner of Baltimore and Breckenridge Streets. A candy store, like Philip Petey Winters on the first block of Chambersburg Street. A photography studio, like Charles and Isaac Tyson had on York Street. Dry goods, general merchandise, and grocers also made Gettysburg hum with activity. James Fahnestock and 2 of his brothers owned the largest general store in town on the corner of Baltimore Street and Middle Street. In 1860, the census listed dozens of people whose occupation was shoemaker or cobbler. Yet, contrary to legend, there was no shoe factory or warehouse full of shoes in Gettysburg in 1863. Tanneries, ironworks, brickyards, blacksmiths, hotels, inns, and taverns rounded out the more common businesses found in town. Prior to the war, the people of Gettysburg engaged in a diverse economy, the primary industry in town being carriage making, which attracted related tradesmen such as wheelwrights, trim and canvas shops, and silversmiths. Many of Gettysburg's carriages were purchased by people south of the Mason-Dixon line, which was some 8 to 10 miles south of Gettysburg. As the Civil War loomed, the industry in Gettysburg began to tighten. But by 1863, the war had all but eliminated the carriage industry. Gettysburg's port for goods and services was Baltimore, which was a city of divided loyalties and political unrest. These 2 factors disrupted the town's economy. Local curmudgeon and former town constable John Burns had a few odd jobs. One of those jobs was a cobbler at the boot and shoe shop of town council president David Kendallhart. Among his other jobs, John Burns pumped water for the Gettysburg Waterworks. Burns, a veteran of the War of 1812, was not known to be a friendly neighbor with a kind word to offer. Gettysburg had the latest technological advances in communications, media, gas lighting, and transportation. In 1858, the railroad had come to town, and by 1863, Joseph Broadhead was an express messenger on the Hanover Junction, Hanover and Gettysburg Railroad. This railroad made the economy of Gettysburg boom when it was built, and in 1863, the line was in the process of being continued westward out of town. By July 1st, the progress made on this extension would be forever immortalized as the railroad cut. There were 2 telegraph offices in town, one at the railroad station and the other in the back of the home of John Scott on Chambersburg Street. Gettysburg had 3 newspapers, the Star and Banner, edited by John T. McElhenney, and the Adams Sentinel, edited by David Bueller. Both had a Republican bias. The Compiler, with a Democrat bias, was edited by Henry J. Staley. Republicans were very pro-union, while the Democrats took a softer stance on the idea of Southern secession. Neither side was keen about the idea of equality for blacks, ironically evidenced by the fact that when, years prior to the war, free blacks attempted to join the local white anti-slavery societies and were denied. And so, those who were anti-slavery and black formed the Slaves' Refuge Society on their own.
We feel it our indispensable duty to assist such of our brethren as shall come among us for the purpose of liberating themselves, and to raise all the means in our power to effect our object, which is to give liberty to our brethren groaning under the tyrannical yoke of oppression. Resolution of the Slaves' Refuge Society.
A total of 10 roads led into Gettysburg, each one leading to and coming from other important cities and towns, such as Carlisle, Harrisburg, York, Hanover, Baltimore, Emmitsburg, Fairfield and Hagerstown, Cashtown and Chambersburg, and Mummersburg. All of these roads eventually funneled into the heart of Gettysburg. The layout of the town was typical for that time period, with the higher valued properties being in the blocks closest to the Diamond, with wide, tree-lined streets of dirt flanked by paved sidewalks. The streets and roads were laid out like the spokes of a wagon wheel, with the Diamond being the hub. Homes along the main roads had no front yards and came right up to the sidewalks. Most of the lots in the first few blocks off the square in any direction were developed and therefore presented an unbroken front. Backyards were surrounded by high board fences and contained a small stable or carriage house, a well and an outhouse or privy, as well as a small garden for the kitchen. All of this restricted free movement to the streets or the alleyways. Gettysburg by 1863 was a large town for the area, with a vibrant population that loved, hated, squabbled, showed kindness, gossiped, rallied together, made local celebrities out of the best looking or most gregarious, while making pariahs out of those of lesser fortune, just like any other society at any other point in history. Unlike most of those other societies, Gettysburg will endure a crucible of worry turned to terror, turned to misery. And that all began on June 15, 1863, when Brigadier General Albert Jenkins's Confederate Cavalry Brigade crossed the Potomac and headed for Chambersburg. Unmistakable signs of the coming storm.
Our regiment was camped on the suburbs of a pretty Pennsylvania town. A stream was near the camp, and one afternoon I suggested to one of the boys in my company that we take a bath and a swim. They took to the idea and likewise to the water in quick time. There were no houses in the immediate vicinity, except for one on a hillside about a half a mile away, belonging to an old Spencer lady. We'd been swimming for a while when a boy trudged into camp in search of the captain. He had a note from the old maid which read, "Dear Sir, I wish you would order your men out of the stream. I can see them plainly through my brother's field glasses." Confederate soldier.
As Lee's army made its way across the Potomac through Maryland, then into Pennsylvania, an air of a pleasure excursion seemed to overtake the men and officers as they gathered supplies stolen from merchants and farmers. But in Chambersburg, merchant Jacob Hoke observed a sinister side to his town's uninvited guests.
One of the revolting features of this day was the scouring of the fields about the town and searching of houses for Negroes. These poor creatures, those of them who had not fled upon the approach of the foe, sought concealment in the growing wheat fields around town. Into these the cavalrymen rode in search of their prey, and many were caught. Some after a desperate chase and being fired at. Jacob Hoke.
Rachel Cormany, another resident of Chambersburg, was also moved to put pen to paper to record the inhumanity she witnessed.
Ugh, how it grated the hearts to have to sit quietly and look at such brutal deeds. I saw no men, all women and children. Some of the colored people who were raised here were taken along. I sat on the front step as they were driven by, just like we would drive cattle. Rachel Cormany.
Scenes such as these were repeated throughout south-central Pennsylvania, though Robert E. Lee had a standing order against bringing harm to persons or property, and that all supplies acquired must be paid for.
No alarm was felt until Governor Curtin sent a telegram directing the people to move their stores as quickly as possible. This made us begin to realize the fact that we were in some danger from the enemy, and some persons, thinking the rebels were near, became very much frightened, though the report was a mistake. Sarah Broadhead.
30-year-old Sarah Sally Broadhead and 32-year-old Joseph had a 4-year-old daughter named Mary. Together, they lived on the 3rd block of Chambersburg Street. After hearing the news of Confederates in Chambersburg, Sarah began a journal on June 15th. Ever since word of the Confederates crossing the Potomac first reached them, residents of Gettysburg and many other south-central Pennsylvania towns were beginning to panic and prepare as best they could for the approaching invaders. No one knew just where the Confederates were heading. No one knew what the Confederates would do to them should they descend upon their city or town. And no one knew where their own army even was to protect them and drive off the rebel hordes. Civilian militias began to form. Still, the townspeople worried, for what good could days-old militia do against Robert E. Lee's formidable veterans?
We had often heard that the rebels were about to make a raid, but had always found it a false alarm. Tilly Pierce, Gettysburg resident, age 15.
In truth, Gettysburg lived under a constant cloud of worry ever since the Civil War broke out in 1861. Just 10 miles to its south is the border with Maryland. While a border state that remained within the Union, Maryland's doing so was fragile. Its citizens had sympathies for both sides of the war. Virginia, the state which was home to the Confederate capital of Richmond, was not much farther beyond Maryland. On April 22, 1861, Gettysburg proudly sent the Gettysburg Independent Blues, its local militia that mainly had experience performing ceremonial duties, off to fight for the Union. Almost immediately, townspeople began to feel uneasy about sending its only armed force away. And so, that same night, the people of Gettysburg gathered in the courthouse to discuss forming a new home guard to ease the people's minds. Out of nowhere, 2 unknown men burst into the courthouse yelling, "The rebels are burning Hanover, and Gettysburg is next." The report was that 500 or more pug uglies from the city of Baltimore, a city with deep Confederate sympathies, were heading towards Gettysburg. As the citizens filtered out into the streets, a single rider galloped into town along York Street. "To arms," he shouted. "The rebels are coming." The calm curiosity that the people of Gettysburg embodied only a moment before gave way to utter panic and chaos. Word spread quickly through the town. The streets were crowded with panic-stricken people. Bells pealed across town to raise alarm. Riders, in the style of Paul Revere, were dispatched in every direction to warn neighboring hamlets and farms. Of course, all firearms and the ammunition for those firearms had left hours earlier with the Gettysburg Blues. All that was left was a smattering of shotguns, antique muskets, shovels, hoes, axes, knives, and a variety of other items of little to no real use against the coming pug uglies. Finally, after midnight, Gettysburg's cooler heads decided to send a train to Hanover to see what was up. The train returned around dawn with the shocking news. It was a false alarm. Time and again between April of 1861 and June of 1863, the alarm would be raised, panic would ensue, and all would be let down as no rebel threat had developed. The only time the threat came close to being real was in 1862 when Jeb Stuart's cavalry invaded Pennsylvania and raided Chambersburg, then appeared at the foot of the mountains at Cashtown, just 8 or so miles west of Gettysburg. But Stuart had no interest in Gettysburg that day, and her citizens, once again, breathed a sigh of relief. Stuart's raid aside, a sense of the boy who cried wolf began to lull the people of Gettysburg into a complacency that would last up until the first shots of the Battle of Gettysburg. With Jenkins's raid on Chambersburg on June 15, 1863, refugees flooded through Gettysburg with the familiar warning of "the rebels are coming." Not all Gettysburg residents brushed off these warnings. Michael Jacobs, a professor at Pennsylvania College, was not so dismissive when he noted in his diary that there were unmistakable signs of the coming storm. Gettysburg quickly snapped out of its trance when the flood of refugees bearing the news of rebels in Chambersburg was too overwhelming to ignore. Immediately, merchants like the Fonstock brothers, as well as local bankers and wealthy citizens, began to load their stores, vaults, and prized possessions onto rented freight trains bound for Philadelphia. In the wee hours of June 16th, at 1 a.m., panic had once again swept through the town as an orange glow lit up the southwestern sky. "The rebels are coming and burning as they go," a voice in the crowd speculated. Fanny Bueller, wife of attorney and Gettysburg postmaster David Bueller, remarked in her memoirs that the people of Gettysburg were in a condition to believe anything. And it seems she was right, for the glow that so scared Gettysburgians during those early morning hours was the town of Emmitsburg, Maryland. Arson was its cause, and the flames brought 27 buildings to the ground before the fire was out. No Confederates had a hand in it. The 16th passed without incident, and another false alarm was raised on the 17th. By this point, some people began falling back into that familiar rut of doubt and complacency. Fanny Bueller recalled that when they did not come, we lost faith in their coming, and it grew to be an old story. We tried to make ourselves believe that they would never come. One day, a crowd had gathered at Alexander Bueller's drugstore on Chambersburg Street. About 60 men had answered Governor Andrew Curtin's call for volunteers to drive out the rebel invaders. These men were immediately shipped off to Harrisburg, where they were mustered into service as Company A, 26th Pennsylvania Emergency Volunteer Infantry, or PEV, and they received rudimentary training.
Upon the first rumor of the rebel invasion, Major Robert Bell, a citizen of the place, recruited a company of cavalry from the town and surrounding country. A company of infantry was also formed from the students and citizens of the place, which was mustered into Colonel William Jennings' regiment of the Pennsylvania Emergency Troops. Tilly Pierce.
Local citizen Robert Bell had the presence of mind to realize that this latest string of rumors could very well be legitimate. And so he reorganized a home guard company of independent cavalry. He went to Andrew Curtin and offered to bring his cavalry to Harrisburg. But Curtin declined because he needed eyes on the Confederate Army's activities in south-central Pennsylvania. Bell returned to Gettysburg and set his cavalry out on patrols in search of advanced elements of Lee's army in the mountain passes at Cashtown and Monterey to the west. Bell's scouts would relay information back to Gettysburg resident David McConaughey. McConaughey, a local attorney turned spy ring leader, was in constant contact with Governor Curtin by telegraph. Major Grantville O. Haller, of General Darius Couch's staff, came to Gettysburg to take command of the defense of that area on June 19th.
June 20th. The report of today is that the rebels are at Chambersburg and are advancing on here, and refugees begin to come in by scores. Some say the rebels number from 20 to 30,000. All day we have been much excited. Sarah Broadhead.
On June 21st, 40 men from the Philadelphia City Troop arrived and joined Bell. Samuel J. Randall, a U.S. congressman, came up from Washington to take command of these men. This small band of civilians playing soldier was all that Gettysburg had to protect it from any possible Confederate incursion into the borough.
Early on this morning, the Philadelphia City Troop, consisting of about 40 members, arrived at Gettysburg, affording us evidence that the border was not entirely forgotten. Professor Michael Jacobs, Pennsylvania College.
2 cavalry companies are here on scouting duty, but they can be of little use, as they have never seen service. Sarah Broadhead.
Bell's cavalry and the Philadelphia City Troop skirmished near Monterey Pass and brought word back to town that Confederates of a sizable force were in the mountains just beyond the border of Adams County.
June 22nd, Sunday. The report now is that a large force is in the mountains about 18 miles away, and a call is made for a party of men to go out and cut down trees to obstruct the passages of the mountains. About 50, among them my husband, started. I was very uneasy lest they might be captured, but they had not gone halfway when the discovery was made that it was too late. that the rebels were on this side of the mountain and coming this way. Our men turned back, uninjured though. Sarah Broadhead.
This small party had encountered the head of a small Confederate force foraging for horses and other supplies. The rebels fired off a few shots, and Bell's men retired to town. Word had come to Gettysburg by telegram that Gettysburg's own Company A of the 26th Pennsylvania Emergency Volunteers was on its way with the rest of the regiment.
June 24th. As I expected, the rebels have several times been within 2 or 3 miles, but they have not yet reached here. Deserters come in every little while who report the enemy near in large force. This morning early, a dispatch was received, saying that a regiment of infantry was coming from Harrisburg. We do not feel much safer, for they are only raw militia. Sarah Broadhead.
The plan for the 26th PEV's return to defend Adams County went off the rails, quite literally, when one of the trains carrying the Green troops collided with a stray cow at Swift Run Bridge, roughly 7.5 miles from Gettysburg, derailing the train. No one was killed or seriously injured besides the cow, and she made for an enjoyable steak dinner for the raw recruits. 120 men of the regiment marched on to Gettysburg, arriving there on the night of the 25th. The remainder of the regiment arrived by rail the following morning.
They can't lock us up forever, and when they set us free, Getty's Bike Tours wants you to know that we've been social distancing since before that was even a term. Now the best way to see the battlefield just got better. When you take a tour with Getty's Bike Tours, you don't have to set foot into any enclosed space. It's all outdoors. Keeping a distance between you and others in your group has always been a matter of bicycle safety, so the more social distance between you and the other riders, the better. While you're welcome to bring your own bike and helmet, Getty's Bike assures you that all of our helmets and bikes are sanitized after each use like they have been for years. Heck, we'll even have hand sanitizer for you, as well as sanitize the pens at the check-in counter. So if you still want to tour Gettysburg after the economy reopens, but don't want to be confined to an enclosed space while doing it, then give Getty's Bike Tours a call at 717-752-7752 or book online at gettysbike.com. Oh, and forgive us if we don't shake hands.
Hello, my name is Chris Troiano, and along with Stephen Canastraci, host the Early American Brass Band podcast.
You can find us wherever you get your podcasts, online at eabbpodcast.com, and you can email us at eabb.podcast@gmail.com.
Thank you very much.
While our doors are still closed to the public due to the shutdown, Victorian Photography Studio is still doing business online. We offer gift certificates, t-shirts, and prints on our website, victorianphotographystudio.com. We are also taking commissions to shoot monuments, landscapes, and architecture out on the battlefield or anywhere reasonably local. Got a favorite photo of yourself, a pet, or your kids? Well, we could take digital photos and turn them into tintypes right in our studio. So email us at vpsgettysburg@gmail.com for prices and details, or go to victorianphotographystudio.com. And don't forget to let them know that you heard about them on Addressing Gettysburg.
Plowman Cider Tap Room brings the spirit of rural Adams County to Gettysburg's historic Lincoln Square. To-go sales of our orchard-based cider occur each Friday and Saturday from 3 to 7 p.m. with pre-orders and shipping available on our website, as well as curbside delivery to our 2 free bagged meters on the square. Stay healthy, stay resilient, and we'll get together when the time is right. Call 717-420-2582 or go to plowmancider.com. That's 717-420-2582 or plowmancider.com.
Dog tags in the Civil War, one of the most devastating Union defeats took place in Florida, Confederate Lancers in New Mexico, a camel as a regimental mascot. Learn this and more on the Untold Civil War podcast, available on iTunes, Spotify, and Buzzsprout website.
Oh, my favorite place to go. Mason-Dixon Distillery. They create their award-winning spirits from grain grown on Gettysburg National Military Park. And they cook their comfort food from ingredients sourced from local farms. For great food, amazing drinks, engaging conversation, and plenty of on-site parking, which is really hard to find here in Gettysburg, head over to Mason-Dixon Distillery, located at 331 East Water Street. Mention you heard this ad on Addressing Gettysburg and get a free dessert with any meal. That's right, I said free, just because you mentioned this show. That's Mason-Dixon Distillery, 331 East Water Street, Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. Okay, I know spots like these are annoying, but they're a necessary evil when it comes to free content, so here we go. There are 3 ways to support this show and the Addressing Gettysburg project as a whole. 1, the most effective way, is becoming a monthly subscriber at patreon.com/addressinggettysburg. That's patreon.com/addressinggettysburg. Our patrons receive access to interviews with experts recorded especially for them. Number 2, the fun way, by getting some merch over at our store at addressinggettysburg.com. Show that you are in the know by wearing one of our t-shirts, hoodies, or other items at addressinggettysburg.com. And number 3, the free way. You shop at Amazon like everyone else, so why not make those unnecessary sales that only make you feel guilty anyway count for something? Every time you want to go and shop on Amazon, go to addressinggettysburg.com first, then click that Amazon banner at the top of the homepage, and sign in and shop like you normally would. The beauty of this is that Amazon gives us credit for qualifying sales while it doesn't cost you 1 cent more than you intended to spend in the first place. But you gotta make sure that you do it every time you shop Amazon. Okay, there. We're finished with the obligatory pitch for your support. Man, our Patreon patrons must be laughing right now saying, we don't have to sit through commercials on Patreon. Wink.
Back in Virginia, at 1 a.m. on June 25th, Jeb Stuart, following orders from Robert E. Lee, left 2 of his 5 brigades with the main body of the army to guard the passes and the army's rear as it crossed the Potomac. Stuart took his remaining 3 brigades on a troublemaking ride around the Union Army. Confederate guerrilla John S. Mosby had earlier reported to Stuart that the Union Army had not moved for 6 days. Lee's orders, though rather vague and confusing, did call for Stuart to cross the Potomac and link up with Ewell's right should Stuart find Hooker's army to be on the move. Within hours of setting out on his ride, Stuart was immediately thrown off course. For starters, when his cavalrymen came through Glasscock's Gap near Haymarket, Virginia, they found Winfield Scott Hancock's entire 2nd Corps spread out in the fields before them. Some light skirmishing took place before Stuart withdrew and moved his troops south and then east to get around Hancock. This same morning, Hooker ordered his army to begin its march north after a 6-day halt in pursuit of the Army of Northern Virginia. Back in Gettysburg, the 26th Pennsylvania Emergency Volunteers arrived on the morning of Friday, June 26th. Though mostly comprised of students from Pennsylvania College, they received a warm welcome from the citizens of Gettysburg as if they were their own. With Bell's cavalry in the lead, the 26th moved down Chambersburg Street and west of town along the Chambersburg Pike. Once they left the town, something of an ominous calm, according to Professor Jacobs, fell over the town. Perhaps enough people believed that their boys would scare Lee's army off, or that the 26th would return reporting yet another false alarm. Meanwhile, the Army of Northern Virginia was on the move. In the lead was Richard S. Ewell's 2nd Corps, with the divisions of Rhodes and Johnson headed northeast towards Carlisle. Ewell's remaining division, under Major General Jubal A. Early, struck out to the east of Chambersburg with the goal of reaching York before eventually cutting north to link up with Ewell. Along the way, just before reaching the Cashtown Gap in the mountains, Early's division burned the Caledonia Ironworks, about 15 miles from Gettysburg. The ironworks were owned by staunch abolitionist and United States Congressman Thaddeus Stevens. Early decided that Stevens and his workers needed a special dose of Southern vengeance. for not only the treatment the Yankee troops had given Early's countrymen, but also as a message aimed directly at Stevens, who Early thought had a most vindictive spirit towards the people of the South. Learning of the Union militia west of Gettysburg, along the Chambersburg Pike, Early rode with 3 brigades north to Mummersburg, while he sent Gordon's brigade east towards Gettysburg, preceded by the 35th Virginia Cavalry Battalion.
Shortly after 2 in the afternoon, Bell's cavalry came galloping through town in helter-skelter fashion, yelling the news that the 26th had been routed and was retreating to the northeast.
Those Confederates who weren't on the trail of the 26th were a mere 2 miles away and heading straight to Gettysburg. The alarms were false no more. To make matters worse, Bell's cavalry, along with the Philadelphia City Troop, which had stayed behind in town that morning, scattered on the roads heading south and east, leaving Gettysburg to once again fend for itself. Sarah Broadhead reported that the town's reaction, even after the episode with Bell's cavalry, was incredulous. No one believed this, she wrote, for they had so often been reported as coming. Then suddenly, rebel cavalry appeared. Disbelief was now shattered by reality. It was the 35th Virginia Cavalry Battalion, known by the terrifying nom de guerre of White's Comanches. Carrie Sheeds dismissed her students from her finishing school near the Lutheran Seminary on the Chambersburg Pike. The girls from the school ran straight for town. Just before entering it, possibly near the home of John Burns, they paused briefly to look back to see if the rebels were really coming. Upon seeing the first rebel riders crest Seminary Ridge about a half a mile away, the gaggle of girls turned on their heels and retreated for the safety of the town. At the intersection of Chambersburg and Washington Streets, they ducked into the perceived safety of the lobby of the Eagle Hotel. A good deal of Gettysburg civilians had already fled the town. 19-year-old Nellie Auchenbaugh's mother would not lower herself to abandon her home. Nellie was learning to be a woman's hat maker or milliner at Mrs. Mary Martin's hat shop.
I was working on a bonnet that Miss Martin, who was very particular, had me rip up twice that day and start over again. And I said, I'm not going home until I finish this bonnet. Not if the whole rebel army comes to town.
A few blocks to the south, the students of Rebecca Eyster's Young Ladies Seminary on the corner of High and South Washington Streets were also dismissed in haste. One of the students there was 15-year-old Matilda Tilly Pierce. Tilly took her teacher's advice to hurry home and raced the 2 blocks to her house. Charles McCurdy, a 10-year-old, was more curious than frightened by the rebels and the excitement they caused. He ran down to the end of Chambersburg Street and found men and boys in a crowd gazing towards Seminary Ridge, trying to find the approaching Confederates. Another boy in the town had a toy cannon fashioned from a section of gas pipe. Surely miming the martial pomp and circumstance he had witnessed in less dangerous days, the boy fired off a salute. While loading for a second one, White's Comanches appeared coming over the ridge, and the men in the crowd stopped the boy out of fear of bringing about a Confederate response. As soon as the Comanches were in sight, the entertainment value of rebels at the gates dissolved into fear and worry, and the mood became a somber one. I waited only for the front line to come into view, Charles McCurdy remembered. Making record time for home and stationing myself on the front porch, watched the spectacular view. White's Comanches reached the bottom of Chambersburg Street and spurred their horses to a gallop, raced through the streets of town, firing their pistols and whooping and hollering as they rode. Sarah Broadhead remembered that the effect was enough to frighten us all, while young boys like Charles McCurdy and Gates Fonstock peered curiously out the windows of their homes, viewing it as rather a leisurely and gentle entry, and enjoyed it as if they were a Wild West show. As Colonel White's rebel cavalry fanned out through town, things started happening more rapidly, and Tilly Pierce, now safely at home, started to become frightened.
I had scarcely reached the front door when, on looking up the street, I saw some of the men on horseback. I scrambled in, shut the door, and hastening to the sitting room, peeped out between the shutters. What a horrible sight! There they were, human beings, clad almost in rags, covered with dust, riding wildly pell-mell down the hill towards our home, shouting, yelling most unearthly, cursing, brandishing their revolvers, and firing right and left. I was fully persuaded that the rebels had actually come at last. What they would do to us was a fearful question to my young mind. Tilly Pierce.
Those members of White's cavalry who headed south down Baltimore Street accomplished little more than stealing a few horses near the Evergreen Cemetery and engaging in a brief firefight with two of Bell's cavalrymen who had not fled far enough. This shootout resulted in the death of George Washington Sandow, a member of Bell's cavalry and the first Union soldier to die during the Gettysburg campaign. By now, the strain on the civilians of Gettysburg was beginning to shed light on underlying animosities between families. Along with the captured horses, the men of White's cavalry captured several boys. Among them was 12-year-old Sam Wade. Sam's family, who lived on Breckenridge Street, was poor, and he was living with the Pierce family as a hired boy. As White's men led the horses and prisoners back towards the center of town, they passed the Pierce residence on the corner of Baltimore Street and Breckenridge. "You don't want that boy," Mrs. Pierce yelled to one of the cavalrymen. "He is not our boy. He is only living with us." "No, we don't," the Confederate yelled back. "You can have him. We are only after the horses." Sam's sister, Jenny, witnessed the whole exchange from nearby. Placing responsibility for her younger brother's present situation on the Pierces, she yelled, "If the Rebs take our Sam, I don't know what I'll do with you folks." Sam was returned to his family unharmed. A while later, Mr. Pierce approached Colonel White at the Diamond to plead for his horse's return. White refused, stating that he had heard that Mr. Pierce was a black abolitionist and that he had two sons in the Union Army whom he supposed had taken as much from the South as they were taking from him. Tilly Pierce was certain that Jenny Wade was the source of White's knowledge of her father's views and her brother's service to the Union cause. Not to let this slight slide, Tilly hinted not so subtly that Jenny and the Wades were Southern sympathizers. This was most likely not true, as Jenny had two brothers and a boyfriend in the Union Army. Even if it were true, it would not have been the only situation during the Battle of Gettysburg when neighbors turned on neighbors to save their own skin. Still, some residents seemed to approach this invasion of their town with a sense of curiosity, as if they were watching some street performance more than an act of war. One such resident was Sarah King, who lived on the eastern side of town. As White's men chased Captain Bell himself, Sarah's father was sitting in his chair near the window with his nose in his newspaper when the chase galloped by the house. "Here they come!" shouted Sarah. "Who?" asked her oblivious father. "The Rebs!" she exclaimed. "Don't you hear the yell?" As Sarah stood with her children on the porch watching the spectacle, her more rational father thought of the children's safety and urged her to bring them inside. "No," Sarah responded. "I want them to see all they can of this." Oblivious to the danger, Sarah thought it was more important for her children to witness history in the making. She got her wish, and by the end of 1863, her children would witness far more history than she had bargained for. Lagging a half hour behind White's Comanches on the Chambersburg Pike was the infantry brigade of Brigadier General John B. Gordon. Now, the gravity of the situation appeared to set in on more of the citizenry. Early had come to Gettysburg with Gordon's brigade, intending to requisition supplies from the good folks of the town. Upon arrival, Early demanded to speak to the mayor, or Burgess, Robert Martin. But Martin had already fled, and so the general had been directed to the home of Borough Council President David Kendallhart. Kendallhart met Early outside his home and stood in front of Early's horse as the general read the list of demands. Kendallhart's daughter recorded what Early wished to requisition: 60 barrels of flour, 7,000 pounds of bacon, 1,200 pounds of sugar, 600 pounds of coffee, 1,000 pounds of salt, 40 bushels of onions, 1,000 pairs of shoes, and 500 hats. Kendallhart responded with a prepared letter. General Early, Sir, the authorities of the borough of Gettysburg, in answer to the demands made by you upon the said borough and county, say their authority extends but to the borough, that the requisitions asked for cannot be given because it is utterly impossible to so comply. The quantities required are far beyond that in our possession. In compliance, however, to the demands, we will request the stores to be opened and the citizens to furnish whatever they can of such provisions, etc., as may be asked. Further, we cannot promise. By authority of the Council of the Borough of Gettysburg, I hereunto, as president of said board, attach my name, D. Kendallhart. Satisfied with Kendallhart's response, Early spared Gettysburg of any acts of retaliation. However, his men did take advantage of merchants opening their doors to them. By all accounts, the appearance of Early's men disclosed how poor and ill-equipped they were. Michael Jacobs remarked on how their filthy condition was a far cry from the chivalrous Southerners they were thought to be. Sarah King compared them to Falstaff's recruits, meaning that they did not look fit for battle, and expressed a feeling of sympathy for them.
Some of the men had a pile of hats on their heads, strings of muslin and other goods trailing on the ground. The blankets, quilts, and shawls were piled on their horses.
The Confederate troops were in such poor condition in the way of clothes and shoes that Albertus McCurdy observed a Confederate riding his horse with spurs strapped to his bare feet. Appearances aside, Early's men did very little in the way of bringing damage to property or person. Unlike their Yankee foes at Fredericksburg, Confederates did not loot Gettysburg, although that's merely semantics, for they purchased their items with Confederate currency that was completely useless to the residents of Gettysburg. But not according to one rebel lieutenant who told Charles Will, proprietor of the Globe Inn on York Street, after purchasing whiskey from him, that in 2 months our money will be better than yours, and we may remain in your state an indefinite time. Sweets were also very prized among Confederates. Young Charles McCurdy lived on Chambersburg Street across from Petey Winter's candy store. Winter, like everyone else, closed up shop prior to the visit from the Confederates. However, once the ragged boys in Butternut noticed what wares Winter had to offer, he was forced to open. Charles McCurdy watched the free-for-all play out across the street. He was encountered by a Confederate trooper with his hat brimming with candy. McCurdy later recalled that the trooper saw an expectant-looking small boy gazing enviously at his store. The trooper, in an act of kindness, let McCurdy take a handful. The circus-like atmosphere the Confederates brought to the white citizens of Gettysburg was proving to be far less frightening than their imaginations had constructed. Not all civilians were so naive. Gettysburg's black citizens could not afford to bury its collective head in the sand like their white neighbors could. For them, capture could mean enslavement, or for all they knew, wholesale slaughter. They could not know for sure what was about to befall them, and few were willing to sit around and wait to see. As they had done many times before, they gathered whatever belongings they could carry, and with their children in tow, left town for their usual hideouts.
On these occasions, it was also amusing to behold the conduct of the colored people of the town. They regarded the rebels as having an especial hatred towards them and believed that if they fell into their hands, annihilation was sure. These folks mostly lived in the southwestern part of the town, and their flight was invariably down Breckenridge Street and Baltimore Street, towards the woods on and around Culp's Hill. I can see them yet. Men and women with bundles as large as old-fashioned feather ticks slung across their backs, almost bearing them to the ground. Children also, carrying their bundles and striving in vain to keep up with their seniors. The greatest consternation was depicted on all their countenances as they hurried along, crowding and running against each other in their confusion, children stumbling, falling, and crying. Mothers, anxious for their offspring, would stop for a moment to hurry them up, saying, "For the Lord's sake, you children, come right along quick. If them rebels done cut you, they tear you all up." These terrible warnings were sure to have the desired effect, for, with their eyes open wider than ever, they were not long in hastening their steps. Tilly Pierce.
The 1860 census listed 186 black residents in the town of Gettysburg. The counties in Robert E. Lee's path had just over 5,600 black people. Many had never lived a day as a slave, nor had most traveled further than 20 or 30 miles from their homes, let alone to the south. When word spread of the Confederate invasion, most fled further north to avoid capture. There was no standing order or policy in the Army of Northern Virginia to round up black people in order to send them south to be sold into slavery. But that did not stop the officers and their units from acting independently and kidnapping and shipping south human cargo along with whatever goods and property they can get their hands on, whether for personal gain or for the benefit of the Army. For whatever reasons, many of Gettysburg's black citizens did not leave town ahead of the approaching sinister gray cloud and were caught and lined up on Chambersburg Street. From there, the moaning and crying mass of misfortune was marched under guard west towards the mountains to be taken south and sold into slavery. Albertus McCreary witnessed the capture of one black man. "Goodbye," he said. "We are going back into slavery." Scenes like this were repeated throughout the early days of the Confederate invasion of South Central Pennsylvania. Some white Pennsylvanians were able to appeal to the Confederates on behalf of their black friends and won their release back into freedom. Mary Warren's mother, feeling sorry for a terrified black minister's widow and child, took them into her West Middle Street home and hid them above her kitchen until it was safe to let them out. As June 26 came to a close, a band with Gordon's brigade set up in the Diamond in front of the home of attorney David Wills and put on an impromptu concert for their hosts. That night, 17 railroad cars were burned by Early's men. The bridge over nearby Rock Creek was also destroyed. Railroad tracks were torn up and telegraph wires were cut. Gettysburg was now cut off from the outside world.
Addressing Gettysburg, Invasion, June 1863, Part 2, was written, narrated, and produced by Matt Callery. Narration directed by Pearl Shannon. Historical figures voiced by Denise Chain, Trent Walker, Ron Bailey, Bob Steenstra, Kelly Steenstra, The History Dame, Keith Harris, and Pearl Shannon. Historical consultation by licensed battlefield guides Tim Smith, Bob Steenstra, and Louis Trott, with additional consultation provided by John Hoptack and Matt Atkinson. Music by Sarah Larson and Danny Stewart, Dusty Lee Elmer, the California Consolidated Drum Band, Kelly Shannon, the Federal City Brass Band, 26th North Carolina Band. Bear Waltz, written by Sarah Larson, performed by Sarah Larson and Danny Stewart. Forward to the Heights, written and performed by Kelly Shannon. Assistant researcher Robin Weir. To book a tour with a licensed battlefield guide, send an email to matt@addressinggettysburg.com. Copyright 20